Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. Good to see you all joining in online. Hello to Sam, Geeta, Kauser friend. Happy New Year, Kauser friend, and happy almost New Year, Sam and Geeta. And happy almost New Year, all the friends here at Empty Cloud Monastery, including Bhante Sudaso, who has been tirelessly teaching Dhamma. Well, as usual, nothing new, but he's also been leading a retreat here at Empty Cloud Monastery. So today is, well, technically the last day of the year of this calendar, or the first year of still this calendar, but in other places, like in Holland. And hello to Mary. Happy New Year. It's nice to see that actually even our neighbors are at 7:30 tuning in for a monk chat. So maybe Bhante, would you like to share some reflections for New Year's? And then we can start with any questions that people might have, maybe New Year resolutions and whatnot.
Maybe you would like to say something since you've been disappeared for quite some time. I'm sure people would love to hear from you.
Well, good to see you also, Kumu, and hello to Charles Lee. Yes, well, I disappeared in Italy, my home country, for some time, and I'm back. Well, with almost intact. I seem to have broken a little bit of an ankle on the way here, on the way back. But it's nice to be in the US, and it was also nice to be in Italy after so long, and especially like visiting so many different Buddhist communities throughout the peninsula. So Bhante traveled with me for a while, and then came back a little bit earlier. But so he's seen a little bit of Italy, and hopefully we'll also see a little bit of Italy again next year as well. So we hope with that. But yeah, in terms of old year turning into new, well, definitely there's this old body that is turning into a newer, older body. So there's been a lot of reflection on decrepitude. I also turned 40 this year. So I feel like, when I turned 30, I got this wrinkle here. I remember I was like, oh, wow, it's a new decade. And then I turned 40 and I twisted my ankle. So it seems like a trend of, kind of the messengers, as we say in Buddhism. Well, yeah, the messenger of decrepitude is definitely knocking at my door, giving me this sense of urgency. So hopefully this will be my last body, as all the enlightened bhikkhus and bhikkhunis and lay people of the past have said. So there's this hope, and maybe Bhante, you want to share something?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing that I wanted to mention, so I've said this a few times over the last few days, is that so there is this custom of New Year's resolutions, of making a resolution. And usually people do New Year's resolutions in actually a not very skillful way. So making big resolutions that they're going to do for an entire year. And this is usually not so effective. So the practice of making resolutions or determinations is an important part of Buddhist practice. But it's better to make small resolutions for short periods of time and then to keep them. So I'm actually a big fan of resolutions. I think they're a really powerful way of stepping up one's practice. But it's important to make resolutions that you actually know you can keep. So things like, I'm going to meditate an extra 5 minutes every day for 1 week. That's a very doable resolution. Anyone can do that. Rather than saying, I'm going to meditate an extra 4 hours a day for an entire year, that's a bit much. You might get discouraged. So make a small resolution, and then after the small resolution is over, then you can think about making a new one. You can reflect, how did that one go, and do I want to make a new one? So we do this, of course, at the time of New Year's. This is a traditional time to make resolutions. But actually, you can do this at any time of the year. It's just the New Year is a time when we remember this idea of resolution, the idea of making determinations. That said, this is in fact monk chat. So last monk chat of 2021. So this is your final opportunity of the year to ask questions to the monastic Sangha. It's also the first time Aya Soma's appeared in monk chat for many weeks now. So I was trying to get her to join last week, and she declined. This time she agreed under duress. So we're happy that she's here to answer questions. So there was, in fact, one question from one of the residents. Do you still have that question?
Yes.
I actually remember exactly what your question was, but if you don't want to ask it anymore, you don't have to.
I do want to ask it. I just forgot exact phrasing of it.
Then ask it fresh, because that's always better.
Okay. So I'm wondering how Buddhism can help me plan my life.
That's actually totally different from the question you wrote before, but okay, we can go with that one. Go ahead.
Maybe you go first, Bante.
I took the past several weeks worth of questions. I think it's your turn.
Well, I might have not done the virtual monk chat, but I actually did a lot of in-person monk chat in Italian in Italy. So, so it's not quite true that I disappeared.
Okay.
But first of all, good to see you, Venerable Dhammadipa. Happy New Year.
Welcome. Yeah.
And
how can Buddhism help you plan your life? Is that what you're asking?
Do you remember my exact phrasing last time?
Your original one was, how does Buddhism give life meaning? It's a very different question.
Yes. I want to ask two of them now.
Okay, that's fine. Well, one at a time. Which one do you want to start with?
How does Buddhism give life meaning?
Ayasoma?
I'll quote actually Venerable Thich Pai, who was a lovely monk in the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition. And he would reply to that question with encouraging you to ask yourself another question that he says it's a lot more interesting, which is, how can I make every single moment of my life more meaningful? And so that's basically an encouragement of, instead of looking for things always outside of ourselves, and that can also apply with Buddhism to a certain extent, in the sense that we're constantly trying to project what is the meaning, what is the purpose, and always seeking something outside that gives us meaning. But instead, actually kind of reconfiguring our mind, reconfiguring our outlook, reconfiguring essentially the way that we go about in life, which is not seeking something outside, but rather transforming our minds by following the Noble Eightfold Path and then making every moment meaningful. So that would be my answer, copied from Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, at least part of it.
and my thought is that, so Buddhism doesn't necessarily give meaning to life. Rather, what Buddhism offers is a set of tools for attaining awakening. So if you wish to make awakening the purpose of your life, then Buddhism will give much that will help with that. But as far as the meaning of life, that doesn't really have anything to do with Buddhism. Actually, from a Buddhist perspective, life is meaningless. It has no meaning. It's actually just running in circles for eternity. That's what life is. But there's the possibility of cultivating wholesome qualities of mind that lead towards perfect wisdom, perfect compassion, and complete freedom from suffering, and an awakening from this bizarre dream of running in circles for eternity. And Buddhism offers a set of tools and techniques that lead us to complete awakening. So if you want to call that meaning, then you can call that meaning if you like. But it's usually somewhat different. When people talk about meaning in life, I actually have no idea what they mean, to be honest. I don't know what that refers to. So to some degree, it actually depends on what do you mean when you say give life meaning. If you mean is there a purpose and a way of reaching that purpose, then yeah, Buddhism does offer that if you want it. But life itself has no meaning. That's actually why we have Buddhism. And what was does that answer your question?
It's the most astute answer ever received. Yes, your version answers.
Okay. And you had a second question?
I think it's kind of interrelated. Obviously, I'm very lost as to what to do in my life. So my second question was, how can Buddhism, I guess, better help me see the meaning and see what I'm trying to aim for to plan it out?
Well, again, Buddhism is not actually about helping you plan your life, but rather it's a set of tools to reflect on what you're doing and why you're doing it, and whether that leads towards awakening or away from it, whether that produces more dukkha or more happiness, whether it produces more wisdom or more foolishness. So I actually wouldn't say that Buddhism is meant to help you plan your life, but rather that it gets you to really reflect, why am I doing what I'm doing? So if the question is like, well, should I have this job or that job? Well, the Buddhist answer would be, well, which one is more wholesome? That would be the recommended one. If you're like, well, should I do this with my life or that with my life? Well, which one is more wholesome? That would be the one to do. So in this way, Buddhism can help you plan your life, in that it's ultimately every choice is boiled down to a simple question. Which is more wholesome. Okay. Yeah, often our plans for our life, it's actually, we're just running on our greed. It's like, well, what do I want from life? And then we chase after things which are just motivated by greed and which don't really bring any genuinely positive transformation to our life. It's just running in circles, like we've been doing for longer than we can remember. That's not really useful. So instead, Buddhism is saying, well, rather than asking, what do I want out of life? Instead, ask, how can I do what is wholesome? How can I do what brings goodness and wisdom and compassion into the world? Okay. Okay. Do you have anything you want to say?
No, I think that covers it pretty much
Okay.
thoroughly.
And do we have any questions online?
Well, Taylor asks, so there are monasteries worldwide. Which one is the coolest? Well, of course, Antikaj Monastery is the coolest one. I'm not biased at all. No, actually, there are a lot of really cool monasteries everywhere. Yeah, Buddhist monastery is cool by definition, right? Actually, the Buddha is the one who designed cool. That's essentially what Nibbana means. A state of cool. Yeah, the ultimate cool. Yeah. Can't get cooler than that. So yeah, there are monasteries pretty much now, I think, in every country, actually. Yeah. So in Africa, there's well, definitely there's one in Uganda that Bhante Budrakita opened, and I think there's something else, but I can't remember. It's South Africa, maybe.
And then also in South America, there's some monasteries.
Actually, there's a lot in South America.
Yeah, it's popular. Buddhism is getting super hot in South America these days.
So isn't that cool?
What's that?
So isn't that cool?
In that sense, so it's
Buddhism
not cool.
is both hot and cool.
But yeah, definitely in South America, Brazil, there's many Buddhists. So yeah, it's quite actually an exciting moment in the way that there's more opportunities to practice Dhamma worldwide. And then, of course, in Asia, I mean, you go to Thailand, it's like the Buddhist Italy. It's wonderful. the sense that in Italy, as Svante Sudaso saw when he came to visit, he was like, all right, is there anything else except for churches? So in Thailand, it's the same, but Buddhist version. So double thumbs up. And yeah, so of course you go to places like Thailand, Sri Lanka, Burma, Taiwan, well, every single place really, and there's a lot of Dhamma. In the West, there's a little bit less, but there's still actually a lot more than there was when I was born, for example. So yeah, it's a very good place. You just put Buddhist monastery, or if you want to be even more selective, you can put Theravada Buddhist monastery or Mahayana Buddhist monastery, Tibetan Buddhist monastery, whatever your flavor of Buddhism is, you prefer. And yeah, go visit and explore. And Geeta, I'm sorry that you hurt yourself as well. Body is fragile and aging. Yes, right? And Dave says, if the Buddha said, avoid doing what is harmful, cultivate the wholesome, purify the mind, and metta for all, isn't it unwise to see eating meat as any of these?
Well, so it's actually interesting. So there was a recorded story in the Pali Canon of a monk who went to the Buddha and said, you should require the monks to be vegetarian. And he said, everyone respects vegetarians. Everyone knows it's more compassionate. It's the right way to do things. And the Buddha said no. The Buddha said, I will not make it a rule that Buddhist monks have to be vegetarian. And interestingly enough, the reason he gave for this is it's because Buddhist monks rely upon the generosity of others. We rely upon alms food, upon what people give us to eat. And the Buddha said that there will be monks who, if they turn down non-vegetarian food, then they won't have enough to eat. Maybe they're in a poor area where all people have to give is meat. They don't have enough vegetarian food to feed the monks. So if the monks refuse the non-vegetarian food, then they won't have enough food to eat. And then they might start thinking that monastic life is too difficult. And they might disrobe as a result. So the Buddha said, out of compassion for the monastics who are living in places like that, where it's hard to get by without accepting offerings of meat, that he would not require vegetarianism. So this is referring specifically to Buddhist monks, of course. So the Buddha also said that the act of receiving and eating a gift of meat is itself blameless as long as you do not suspect that the animal was killed specifically for you. So again, this is referring to Buddhist monastics. So we're going alms round. So maybe somebody was making some meat for themselves, and they see a monk walking by and they're like, oh, I'll give the monk some of this. It's completely blameless. Nothing is being killed for you. It's just what the person was eating anyway, and they decided to give some to you. Now, if you're a lay person, it's a little more complicated because as a lay person, you're always voting with your money, so to speak. So if you go to a store and you buy meat, then you are encouraging the meat industry, which is one of the most horrifying industries in the modern world. And also as a lay person, you can very carefully control your diet. If you're quite poor, then it can be difficult. But generally speaking, as a lay person, you can control your diet well enough to eat a perfectly nutritious and balanced diet without eating meat. For most people, there's a small percentage of people who that's not possible for medical reasons. But the vast majority of people, if you control your diet carefully, you can have a perfectly nutritious vegetarian lifestyle. So if you're a lay person, then yeah, of course it's better to be vegetarian. Again, unless you have an inescapable medical reason not to. It's better to be vegetarian. But it's a different story for monastics because we rely entirely on what other people give us. That said, most Buddhist monks in the world are vegetarian. If you count Mahayana and Theravada, most Buddhist monks are vegetarian. And those who are not vegetarian, again, it's for this reason. It's because we rely upon what other people give us. So the practice that the Buddha recommended for monastics is to practice contentment and gratitude. But for lay people, there actually is a rule, for example, of not trading in meat. It's one of the forms of wrong livelihood is to trade in meat. The Buddha put that in the same category as trading in weapons, trading in poisons, trading in intoxicants, and trading in slaves. But again, this is for lay people, not for monks. And that's because lay people are part of the world economy. They're part of the industrial machine, whereas monastics are not. We're entirely outside of the social order. So hopefully that answers your question. Anything you want to add?
No, I think you covered it. Oh, thanks, Bante. And Kumu says, is it possible to do the Anapanasati Sutta in detail sometime next year? I'm pretty sure that will come up. And Happy New Year's. Yes, to you all as well. And and Carl says, for me, the coolest is a small one in Elmhurst, Queens, where I get to interact with my Buddhist family and their children. We know the one that you're talking about. It's the Indonesian Buddhist temple from our friends over there. Yes, we agree. It's definitely on the cool list. And Protodhamma says, Bante, how do you enjoy solitude and avoid loneliness? Since it says Bante, I assume it's for you.
So we've already determined that Bante is technically gender neutral. So, and I just answered one, so I think it's your turn.
Okay. How do you enjoy solitude and avoid loneliness? I actually don't have to put that much effort into that. And I haven't had to put that much effort into that since I've been 15. I kind of had to actually train myself to do the opposite, to be okay with company. So I'm perhaps not the best person to ask this question in the way that has never really been a problem for me to be alone. But there is a difference between being alone and being lonely. So I remember that at a certain point when I was 14 or 15, somewhere around that age, I was alone, but also lonely. And there was a bit of an unhappiness in the mind. Actually, quite a lot. I was a pretty depressed teenager in Rome. And yeah, so there was this sense, where was it coming from, essentially? So back then I had no idea. So yeah, I just kind of created conditions in order to force myself to socialize with whoever I thought was cool around me. And I think I spent actually even more than my teenage years pursuing that. I think I went up to my 30s or so associating with the cool, but not in the Buddhist sense of it, but rather always pursuing, a little bit connected actually also to what Sue was asking before. It was this constant quest of what is the purpose of all of this? So my mind was constantly telling me these answers like, oh, okay, you're going to be happy if you hang out with those people, or you hang out with those other people, or if you have this kind of job, or if you live in this kind of place, or if you have that kind of relationship, etc. And so being, I guess, a Greek type, I was pursuing all of these things that my mind was kind of projecting in front of me. And I remember there were a lot of disappointments with the cool kids. Yeah, I remember, I think, when I managed to become friends with the cool kids in high school, then when I started hanging out with them after a while, I was like, they're really not that cool. So then I was like, okay, let me try these other cool kids. And I'm like, actually, they're not that cool either. And then again and again and again. So that, I guess, created the conditions for my mind to become a little bit dispassionate as we were going. But then instead of being dispassionate with everything, I was just trying other ways, as I mentioned earlier. So I was like, maybe it's not people that are going to make me happy per se, like the cool kids, but maybe it's, the relationship or the job, etc. And then fast forwarding, I got a lot of dukkha of getting what I wanted. And I was really confused of why I was still not happy. And I was in New York City. I had achieved a lot of different things that supposedly were the recipe for happiness. And there I was going like, oh, what am I supposed to do next? I kind of like checked almost all the things, all the all the boxes, and it's kind of predictable from here onwards. And then I found the Buddhists, actually for the second time. I had already found them first, but I was not ready. My mind was still like, yeah, I don't know about this suffering. There's a lot of like sukha, aside from the dukkha. But the second time, actually, and it was Bhante Sudaso, there was something in his teachings that, yeah, it was the right time, right place. And I remember understanding the other meaning of dukkha, which is essentially dissatisfaction, that everything is unsatisfying by its nature. So it's that inversion of mind that we think that, objects or relationships or jobs or whatever are satisfying. And then the more they are not satisfying, we keep on going through this quest. But yeah, so that created the conditions for me to actually start practicing the Buddhist teachings and then become more and more happy and less unhappy. And paradoxically, acquiring less and less and letting go of more and more up until, I shaped my head and put the ochre robe on. And here I am with lots of precepts. So getting back to your question, how do you do that? What was the question again? I don't remember anymore. How do you enjoy solitude and avoid loneliness? Well, once you start cultivating the mind, once you start, especially actually, cultivating wholesome mental states, both in formal meditation and in day-to-day life, then actually your mind becomes a more pleasant place to be, if not a divine abode. That's what we cultivate. For example, metta, as the person who was asking the question before mentioned, is a divine abode. Yeah, a mind of metta is actually quite pleasant. A mind of mudita, a mind of obviously upekkha, a mind of karuna, a mind of compassion. So you're like, oh, actually, this is not too bad. I kind of like hanging out in here. I don't really need that much stuff outside. So you stop seeking, and since suffering is caused by desire, then you stop suffering. So there's no loneliness anymore, and there's more happiness. So that's my long story long to your question. And Bhante, would you like to add?
Yeah. My recommendation is to meditate more.
Great. Yeah, that summarizes. That was long story short. And a Facebook user, doesn't mention who, says, you guys are very active and savvy with social media. I find social media to be a helpful tool, but sometimes causes me suffering. How do you avoid the pitfalls of envy, jealousy, and FOMO with social media? I also don't have that with social media.
Well, I mean, personally, I just mostly don't use social media. But as you mentioned, it's a tool. So it's kind of like a chainsaw. A chainsaw is a very powerful tool that you can cause a tremendous amount of damage with. So when you go to turn on a chainsaw, you should have a very clear sense of exactly what you're going to do. don't turn it on until you know exactly what you're going to cut, how you're going to cut it, and when you're going to stop. And as soon as you're done with the job, you turn off the chainsaw. So then you won't have any problems. But if the moment you get home, you turn on your chainsaw and you start walking around the house with the chainsaw in your hands, like running at full speed all the time, and you're always like whacking it into bookshelves and other people, and then of course you're going to cause a huge disaster. And then you might say that chainsaws are the problem and throw away your chainsaw. Well, that's actually really missing the point. The point is that if you're misusing a tool, then of course it's going to cause problems. So similarly, before opening any social media app, have a very clear sense of exactly what you're going to do. Turn it on, do just that, and then turn it off. So have a clear sense of self-restraint and clear purpose with what you're doing. And remember something very important, which is that social media apps are designed to be addictive. They're designed to consume your time. They're designed to pull you in, to grab you, to capture you. That's what they're designed to do. So don't be surprised if that's what happens. And set up a very clear intention before going in. Set up a very clear intention that you're not going to let that happen. So these are a few thoughts. As for envy, jealousy, and FOMO, envy of what? Jealousy of what? And I think back to those rare times when I would start scrolling through Facebook and I was actually mostly horrified and disgusted. I wasn't feeling envy and jealousy at all. Yeah,
That's intense.
Was that a little too much honesty?
But actually, I would say that so FOMO, if you're experiencing the fear of missing out, that's actually connected to the question that the person asked before in terms of loneliness. So what we do is in Buddhism cultivate what we call JOMO here at Empty Cloud anyway, not universally in Buddhism, but the joy of missing out. So that's the thing. Why do we have the fear of missing out? And hence, I guess, envy and jealousy, etc. And especially social media has this kind of way of portraying, you know, everybody's having the time of their lives and you're the only one who's miserable at home. Right? So then, of course, there is that, fear of missing out, because it's actually like not real, not connected with reality. It's just a bunch of everybody displaying their ideal life. And actually, perhaps you're doing the same thing, you know, you're on social media and you're like, posting the thing. We do the same thing actually at Empty Cloud Monastery. You don't ever see like, Ayasoma woke up grumpy today. Or
Bhante Suraso's robe looked a bit sloppy.
Yeah. Or while I like twisted my ankle in Italy, that wasn't posted on social media. Yeah. Or Ayasoma reflecting on decrepitude by herself and getting a little bit depressed about being unenlightened and closer to death, right? So to a certain degree, we kind of all do it. All show our sort of best face, but we're kind of aware of when we're doing it. But for some reason, we are not that that wise in actually reflecting that everybody else is once again portraying either the best version of themselves or only the positive things that are happening in their lives, or perhaps even fabricating it all together since their life is a complete mess, right? So, how many supposedly lovely, incredible, romantic relationships were happening during COVID, yet there was the highest divorce rate and, and crisis, right? So there's, a bit of a dissonance between the facts and the actual things that people were portraying. So yeah, the fear of missing out is that we constantly have this sort of, but we kind of fabricate it ourselves. We are the donkey, and we also place the carrot in front of ourselves, and we constantly chase it and chase it and chase it and keep believing the story. So the joy of missing out is actually trying something else. Essentially, that's what the Buddha tells us. He tells us to, contemplate every single thing that we're experiencing in terms of the gratification of it, which we're usually very good at. And we stop there, especially in Italy. I realized that I was like, wow, it's like an entire country that really got specialized in the gratification of sensual pleasures. We just stopped that there. And there is no drawback, no contemplation of the drawback. So then when the drawback comes, so when something is not up to par, or it's over, or it ends abruptly, or it changes, then we're shocked. And so then the usual escape that we go to is, the pizza is over. So, the Romans got to the point of actually throwing up so that they could eat more pizza. Just kind of disgusting, right? Like that's samsara right there. Like you eat something and then you're like, oh, I'm full. I can't eat anymore. So let me vomit again so I can eat again. Like just completely, but this is what we do with everything essentially, right? So we keep looking for something else that feels pleasant, that gives us gratification. But instead the Buddha goes like, hey, how about you just relinquish the desire for it to begin with, and you're okay with it, right? So of course at the very beginning it's easier said than done, and we're like, oh yeah, makes sense, or actually maybe it doesn't make sense, but it's worth giving it a shot, since the first technique didn't really work out for how many years I have. And if you remember past lives, also like multiple lifetimes. But then when you're at it, you're still fooled by it, right? But actually then there are these moments, the more you try, the more you practice, the more then you become skilled at it. And the more you're okay. Like actually in 2 months while I was in Italy, because people are, we can't only eat up to a certain time in the day, which basically is breakfast in Italy, which together I think with France, maybe it's the only 2 countries in the world where breakfast means croissants and coffee, or just sweets. There's no savory things. So I was not able, well, actually, it's not true. Only once I was able to get a Neapolitan pizza, which used to be my obsession as a lay person. Neapolitan pizza done right, like properly, well. Right, 2 months, I was only able to get it once, and it was like, dukkha, because of course, all the good places are open only at a certain time, and you have to, go there and sit down and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I still remember I was like, at a certain point I was in Naples, and these lovely lay people, were like, oh, we'll bring you to have some Neapolitan pizza. And I was like, oh yeah, great. Oh, I'm a monk, I'll pretend I'm equanimous. Oh yeah, Neapolitan pizza in Naples. Like my latent greed type was like, yeah, that's gratifying, even though it's not it's not that great. It would be great for that moment. And then of course we go there, and the restaurant is like, hey, come on, it's 11, we're still having breakfast. So we had to go somewhere else. But back like a couple of years ago, I would have been so upset. I would have actually probably even cried. I was really like this. I'm really bad with food. I was very attached to food. But now I was just like, okay, actually it's fine. I don't need this. How many amazing pizzas have I had in the past? So many. I was born and raised in that country. And actually my mom is from that area too. So I had plenty. Have they ever actually made me happy? No. So yeah, then why do we keep believing this thing? So that's where the fear of missing out comes on. And you're like, oh, actually, it's the joy of missing out. I can be happy whether or not I have Neapolitan pizza, or whether, today there are boiled things or sauteed things, or it's that cuisine or this other cuisine, And wow, contentment is much better than this extreme, happiness or extreme unhappiness that we tend to veer towards. And Hoskan, or Hoskan, maybe. As a designer, it is difficult to refrain from movies, music, etc. So I decided to be conscious of what emotions rises on my mind while doing that. Could that be considered a practice of mindfulness? Bante?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so mindfulness of emotion fits under mindfulness of mind, which is one of the four satipatthana, the four domains of mindfulness. So yeah, that's definitely an important thing to do, and also to keep in mind that movies and music and so on are they're designed to produce strong emotions. They're meant to produce strong emotions. So it's quite normal that when you're watching a movie or listening to music, it's quite normal that strong emotions are going to arise in you. So it's good to recognize this emotion is not me. This emotion is created by the designer of this movie. This emotion is created by that musician. They've created this emotion, and now it's passing through my mind, and then it's going to move out of the mind. But it's not me. This emotion is not something I'm doing. It's not something I'm creating. It's the direct design of the movie director or the musician or whoever. So then it can become a practice not just of mindfulness, but also of anatta sanya. So recognizing the impersonal nature of emotion. That said, of course, it's better to just not watch movies and not listen to music. That's always the best option in these cases. So if it actually gets to a point where you find it really intolerable, then you might actually have to think about trying to get a different job. There does come a point in one's life where one has to make these sorts of decisions. But for the time being, the practice that you're describing is a good way to go for now.
May I ask a
So,
follow-up
yes.
question to Aisoma's pizza story? So, I mean, I kind of know what your answer might be, but for more wholesome experiences, there's a lot of sense of FOMO on my part too. Like some of my highlights in life is swimming with turtles in Bali, or this amazing hike I've taken. And there are quite a few things on my list of like, I want to do this before saying no to it. How do you justify that?
The bucket list?
Yes, bucket list. And also like what about family time? Having, certain connections. I feel like, I'm not saying I'm going to go into monastic life, but how do you justify reaching towards those more wholesome, are they, moments?
Yeah, I would say that, to a certain degree, until we're enlightened, or at least have certain degrees of enlightenment, we'll all have some, I wouldn't call it FOMO. It's not fear of missing out, but it's just craving for sensual pleasures. I saw this picture of Ravello, which is the place where my mom comes from, and where I spent the first 20 years of my life's summers. My grandparents were from. And it's actually one of the most beautiful places in the world. Except that up until the age of 20, when I was going there, I hated the hell out of that place. Because it's very quiet, nothing is going on. And I just wanted to be in the United States getting drunk and like, I don't know, whatever I was watching on TV, that seemed like a really appealing sort of state of existence. And I had never been to the States, of course. So it was all my imaginary of like watching, TV. But it's very interesting because it's literally like a marvelous place. And now that I'm a monastic, it's quiet, it's beautiful, it's peaceful, I'm like, oh, I would love to go there. And of course, there's also those childhood memories that, on the other hand, were pleasant, of being there with my grandparents and whatnot. So heartwarming, etc. So I had that sort of longing, and I was like, oh, how very interesting. So it comes back to what we're saying earlier. I was trying to say earlier, in terms of analyzing the gratification. Of course, there's gratification in samsara. If there wasn't a pleasantness in all these activities, we wouldn't engage in them. I mean, we're not that dumb. We're a little dumb, but not that dumb, right? There must be like something good in Neapolitan pizza, or in the meal, or in whatever we're doing, in music, anything, architecture, etc. So there is. We have to acknowledge that. We can't pretend that it's fine. Everything is, whether we have soup or feces for lunch, everything is okay, right? Like, that's not what the Buddha is saying. But actually, the Buddha encourages us to be completely aware of the gratification of things, and then also look at the drawbacks before and during and after, I would say. So yeah, contemplate these experiences, watch the mind, understand how the mind works. The point of, for example, being in the present moment is not for the sake of just being in the present moment, just because we like being in the present moment. What is the purpose of all of this? To establish the mind in mindfulness is to understand how greed, hatred, and delusion come into being in the mind, how we start craving things, and how we create suffering for ourselves. So the more we're present in the moment and observe the poisons in the mind, then the more we become wise and we start dismantling it. And then the other way out becomes easier. Do you understand what I mean? Like, you start seeing, yeah, you can pursue whatever you need to pursue. It's not that I stopped, for example, what I was doing overnight and I became a monk, It took me quite some time. And it was great. Every single moment of it. So actually, when I became a monastic, it wasn't some weird thing. I was already a monastic. It was more actually just saying it out loud. I had shaved head. I was practicing the precepts. I was living in a monastery. I think I met you that I was a layperson. Yeah, so I was already living basically a single monastic life, or a monastic life, really. And I was like, okay, I look like a monk. I quack like a monk. I live in a monastery, but maybe, either in or out kind of thing. And I decided to stay in. So I wouldn't focus too much on the form. I wouldn't focus too much on the shoulds, but I would focus more on the practice, and literally looking, analyzing. If you still have a bucket list, by all means, pursue it. But also, don't fool yourself with it. Like, actually be present in every moment. Be present with the gratification. Be present with the dangers. And then look at your mind, and am I still satisfied? Yeah. And so you see it, So with relationships, like, this is what I started doing. For me, celibacy is not a problem at all. Why is it not? Because I actually contemplate that. How many relationships, every time, like, it looks so new, so so like, oh, this is going to be the right one. And then in hindsight, I'm like, oh, it's like such a predictable pattern. Like, it's always the same thing. And then you start seeing it outside as well. And you're like, well, actually, my relationship or my relationships weren't that special. Every single person has exactly the same predicament. It just seems so unique because we focus on the exteriority. But in essence, we're all a big bundle of greed, hatred, and delusion. So it's just that this bundle of greed, hatred, and delusion likes, pizza, and, he might like pasta. And then we focus on, oh, well, the pasta and the pizza are very different. But fundamentally, suit. I mean, the core is exactly the same. The core is it's our greed, hatred, and delusion, essentially. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
I just add one thing to that. So a very useful reflection from the suttas that I sometimes use whenever I have some craving for some experience. The Buddha said that whenever you see somebody having a pleasant experience, you can remember at some point in this long, long cycle of life after life after life, at some point I've had exactly the same experience and it did not satisfy me. So I use that same reflection. It's like my mind is like, oh, well, I really want to do such and such. And I'm like, wait a minute, I've done it before. Countless times in countless lives, I've done exactly that. What is it? Hiking in the Grand Canyon? I've done it 100 million times. Didn't get me one step closer to awakening. I might have had a great time, or I might have not had a great time. I know one monk who went hiking in the Grand Canyon thinking he was going to have a great time, and he wound up hurting his ankle. And actually, he said that it was miserable. Like it was really not a fun time. Beautiful place, but it wasn't fun. But anyway, just whatever it is, whatever you think it is, whether it's a perfect relationship or good times with your family or whatever, you can think, I've already done that 100 million times. Why do I want to do it 100,000,001 times? What do I think is actually going to be achieved by doing it 100,000,001 times? I see a yeah, but coming up.
Not yeah, but just and. So even yesterday during the talk, you mentioned, and I think I asked this before, but I think we taught a few more 100 million times. the rebirth and the different worlds. Do you have to just have faith and believe that's true, or is there any way to actually glimpse that is true? That I have hiked the Grand Canyon and Patagonia 100 million times, so I don't have to do it anymore this lifetime.
Actually, you can see it in this life. How many different lives have you lived in this life? Like, how many distinctly different people have you been in this life? So I can actually divide my life up into several distinct zones where I was basically a completely different person. It's like the first zone would be like from the age of 0 to 5 or 0 to 6 or so. That was one distinct person. Actually, 0 to 3, I don't even remember. So like 0 to 3, then 3 to 6, then like 6 to 12 or so, another distinctly different person. 13 to 17, another distinctly different person. 17 to 20, another really radically different person. And 20 onward, I've been in monastic life, but even within that, I could subdivide it into remarkably different people. So even just looking at this life, I can see that I've been basically a different person many times. As for observing the process of different experiences, actually another thing is to reflect on dreams. I've had some amazing experiences in dreams. So what's so different? One of the interesting things about dreams is that most people, most of the time, when they're dreaming, they believe it's real. What makes you think this is any different right now? So I've had amazing experiences in dreams. And then I woke up and I realized that it didn't mean anything. What makes you think this is any different? Those are a few things you can think about. Yeah.
Another thing that really actually helped in my path was the realization that you only live once is not a secular concept, but it's actually a Judeo-Christian concept. So everything that is secular from every country comes from the spiritual. So this was something that until I entered Buddhism, it never occurred to me. So it's essentially, in Christianity, in Judaism, in Islam, you only live once and then you go to paradise, hell. In Catholicism, we also have purgatory. And so the secular just keeps that concept and removes the afterlife. So it's very interesting, because then when you go to secular places, so in the Goenka tradition, this is when I actually, it dawned on me. A friend of mine who I didn't know he was Christian. When we were in Rockaway, he had never come to Buddhist insights because, well, Buddhist insights and, well, clearly monks. So he was like, I'm not setting foot there, but he was interested in meditation. So he went to a Goenka retreat. And then I met up with him afterwards, and I was like, oh, how did it go? And he was like, oh, it was awful. I was brainwashed the entire time. And I was like, how is it possible? Like, I mean, it's a secular place, like, but there's no religious concept there. And he's like, yeah, the guy couldn't stop talking about karma and rebirth. And in that moment, it dawned on me. And I was like, oh, because Goenka was Indian. So, of course. Like, to him, it was, like, duh, karma and rebirth. It wasn't like a special sort of supernatural thing. That's mainly like a sort of status quo. So then I started thinking, well, why do I actually think that YOLO is something that I can prove, or where is my standing point? So this is so practice that we do in Buddhism to understand not only the dogmas of religion, but rather the dogmas that are inside of our minds. Like, why do we believe the things that we believe? Why do we even believe that we were born, for example? Nobody remembers being born. So it's out of faith. Faith in what? In a piece of paper, in a certificate? Like in exactly what? And also when you see the science, like Western science, for example, in terms of the body, like the body that I had when I was 4 years old is entirely different from the body that I have right now. This is not Buddhism. This is not anyone saying these things. I mean, Buddhism says that too, but but point being, I'm not coming from that standpoint, right? So there's all these, like, we see certain, when it comes to the physical world, actually it matches completely with Buddhism. It's just that in the West, we kind of stop there to the physical. And there's cause and consequence everywhere. But then there is, for no apparent reason, there is, birth, and no apparent reason there is a death, or no apparent consequence after the death. So there's these arbitrary moments that are erratic, like in the human experience, where everything else instead is a process of cause and consequence. So what I find actually, when I started reflecting, both in terms of my experience, the one that I remember anyway, and in every moment, actually, Buddhism is the only system that gives a rational explanation of everything. So the Buddhist system is intellectually the most comprehensive. There's nothing that contradicts anything. There's nothing erratic, as opposed to any other system, whether it's secular or religious. To me, at least, there's always some incongruence or some question mark or some, like, well, okay, this happens for random reasons. But yeah, that has been sort of faith in my experience that has created this confidence of, that it makes so much more sense. Why, there are certain tendencies of the mind. Some you remember, when I was a little girl, this happened, blah, 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 etc. And now I react like this. But some other things, no. Who teaches a child how to be greedy, hateful, and deluded as soon as they're born in a specific different way, right? Well, Western science tells you it's completely random. Yet everything else, yet for some reason, what happens within this life, actually, you go to therapy and everything is logical, and there's the history of trauma and this and that, right? But then at the point of birth, and now they're trying to go into some other ways of explaining it, but it's all like very, I don't know, it's very creative writing. I feel like actually people tend to have a lot more faith in recent Western developments than in what the Buddha taught 2,500 years ago that was way ahead of his time and our time today.
And also just looking, what is your experience? What is your experience of life? It's one of a continuous chain of moments of consciousness shaped by cause and effect. That's your actual experience. So why would you believe anything different? Why would you believe that at some point you just randomly appeared out of nowhere, and at some point in the future you're just going to randomly disappear? That's not our experience. It never has been. Our experience is one of a continuous chain of moments of experience linked by causality. That's our actual experience. So you're actually constantly proving to yourself karma and rebirth every moment of your life. Okay? Okay, we should keep going. There's a lot of questions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, Kaiser Friend says, in Buddhism, is there something that sets the gods apart from other beings besides place of abiding, lifespan, and power? What makes them gods rather than just another type of being? This is a great question for you, Bhante.
Well, actually, I don't like to translate the word deva as God. Also, the word Brahma, I don't like to translate as God. And the reason for this is because the word God in the Western mindset is very different from the words Deva and Brahma. So Devas, Brahmas, these are beings who their mind is basically exactly the same as ours. Their mind is not different from ours. It is, in fact, as you say, it's where they live, it's how long they live, it's what they're capable of doing, it's what kind of body they have. That's different. But their mind is not really any different from ours. It's the same. It's Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana. It's exactly the same. But when you say God, then there's this understanding like there are the mortal beings, us, and then there are the gods like Jupiter and Diana and Thor and all those, or Jehovah or whatever. Like there's these gods, and they're distinctly qualitatively different from us mortals and us non-gods. But that concept just isn't present in Buddhism. In Buddhism, there's an understanding that devas and brahmas are really not so different from us. It's just the conditions of their life are much more pleasant for the most part. They experience the world in a somewhat different way than we do. But also every deva, every brahma in the past, they've been humans. We've been devas and brahmas in the past. It's just one of the stations of consciousness that you can move through as you wander through samsara. There's nothing particularly special about it. Yeah, so I don't like to call them gods because, again, when you use the word God in English, it conjures up the sense of some kind of exceptional being that is somehow distinctly different from other beings. But in Buddhism, that's not the understanding at all. Okay. Yeah, devas, brahmas, these beings are not immortal. They're not omniscient. They're not all-powerful. They're mortal and they're limited. So the term God is not the right word for them.
Thank you, Bhante. And Dave had a follow-up question on the meat eating. But wouldn't the monastic rather politely decline, teach the lesson of metta for animals and be hungry rather than eat an animal that was killed, even if not for them directly? Well, there was a Zen saying where a student goes to the master and goes, what is a teaching of a lifetime? And the master says, an appropriate response. So I would say sometimes the one that you suggested could be the appropriate response. Sometimes it's not the appropriate response. And as Bhante said, yeah, it's circumstantial. Sometimes when we get into these food questions, even though technically our monastery is vegetarian, but there's a Tibetan monk, I think, I can't remember, maybe it was the Dalai Lama, who said something along the lines that sometimes we care too much about what we put in our mouth and what we put out of our mouth, that comes out of our mouth. And that comes from, this also a lot of the privilege, the economical privilege that exists, definitely in the United States of America, but in the West overall. And so, yeah, for most of humans' life, the food preference was food. So, and still it's the case actually in most of the world, really. So to go, you have, when I went to Thailand, actually, there's so much, people have so much, how they say, admiration for the older Western monks, like Ajahn Pasanno, Bhante Sudazo's preceptor, and the other venerables, Ajahn Jayasaro, etc. And one of the things that actually really caught my attention when I was talking to people there was they were all mentioning how these monks, when they were, living in Thailand many, many years ago, they were living in some of the poorest parts of the country, and where people had very little food to eat for themselves, let alone to give to the monastics. And so, what was available for them was a lot of time insects. And so then they would put it in the monk's bowl, these like little, whether it was, crickets, ants, boiled frogs, etc. Yeah. And the Thai people there that were sharing these stories, they were like, well, I wouldn't ever eat those things. It's quite impressive that these monks that were coming from Western countries, in a sort of place where they were coming from, well, definitely relatively wealthy places in comparison to the area where they were in Thailand. Yeah, they humbly accepted all of these offerings and never complained once, or never even moved to another part of the country where they could get better food. Ajahn Pasanno actually went to the point that he almost got blind, was blind, right?
Yeah, because he was just receiving what they were giving him, and it actually wasn't nutritious. Like, it wasn't a nutritionally balanced diet, but he was just gratefully receiving the food. He was just grateful that people were feeding him.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, as Ayasoma is saying, you really need to consider what is the most appropriate response in any situation. So I mean, sometimes, in my case, sometimes I'll do what you're saying, and I'll take the vegetarian things that are offered, and I'll explain why I usually eat vegetarian and why it's a compassionate choice. Sometimes that's what I'll do. But sometimes actually you just practice contentment and gratitude. Again, I remember going alms round in Italy, and this old man comes up to us and he's asking us, like, what are you doing? And he's clearly really weirded out by these like two young bald people in weird outfits with metal bowls standing in this little dinky town in southern Italy. And he's like, he goes away and he comes back and we're still there, and he asks us, like, what are you doing? Why are you standing here? And she explains what we're doing. And then once he understands that we don't have any food and we don't have any money, and we're only going to eat whatever people give us that day, and in fact that morning, then what does he do? He goes off to the store and he buys some food and he brings it back and gives it to us. And some of what he gave us were these little packets of tuna. And what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to tell this man, like, you bought the wrong thing, take it back to the store and get me something else? No, that would be horrifyingly disgusting. Instead, it's thank you. You're so kind. You're such a generous person. It's so wonderful that you're going out of your way, spending your time and money to feed these two weird strangers who just showed up in your town. Like, how amazing is that? Like, these bald weirdos, like dressed in brown bed sheets, show up in his town, and he goes out of his way to go and buy food for them to eat that morning. I'm not going to refuse this man's incredible generosity. Now, maybe if I have someone who every day they're bringing me food, and I start to form a relationship with that person, and I start teaching them the Dhamma, then I might start talking about vegetarianism and why vegetarianism is a compassionate choice. But I'm not going to do that on day 1 or day 2 or day 3, maybe day 10. Um, what's that?
Did you eat that tuna?
Oh, yeah, of course. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had enough food. It was exactly like the Buddha said. If we had refused the meat, then we would not have had enough food to eat. Exactly what the Buddha said. So also, those situations make me understand the compassion of the Buddha. So when the Buddha refused to require vegetarianism for the monks, he did so out of great compassion. So people say we should be vegetarian out of compassion, and that's true. But it's also good to remember the Buddha did not require it because of his compassion. Yeah, on that day, if we had refused the tuna, we wouldn't have had enough food to eat. So that was a day when I really understood. This is only one example. This has happened on other occasions as well.
Yeah, it's important to highlight how there's also the sutta of Buddha Vipassi, if I remember correctly. One of the former Buddhas, actually, that there is someone that while he's eating meat tells him that it's improper for a contemplative to be eating meat, and how that was going to contaminate his mind. Actually, Buddha Vipassi, if I remember correctly.
I think so. I'd have to look it up.
Specifies precisely that actually the eating of meat itself is blameless. There's no, it's just eating. The way through which one acquires whatever they're eating is what makes the difference. And when you are accepting alms, it's blameless, unless of course you have a say into it. Then that's where you interact, which is why actually this monastery is vegetarian, because there is a sense people are coming here for a specific reason. We're also in the West, it's very determined. Usually, it's a little bit different when you go Pindapata. And it's also different in different parts of the world. So yeah, sometimes, the practice is just to accept what is offered and allow people to make merit. And also, be content with, it's also not our food preference, right? So it can be a little bit challenging, but yeah.
So what if that meal, when that man gave you tuna, and then at the same time someone else also give you vegetable? Would you not eating that tuna, but rather eat vegetable because you already have a choice right there in two different things? Would you not eating tuna but eat vegetable because that is your practice to begin with? If you have two, you're not going to turn away the tuna because he gave it to you. You accept that, but now it's in your bowl. Would you pick the tuna, put it in your mouth, or is it vegetable in your bowl as well? Would you just eat vegetable?
Well,
usually this would happen actually when we used to do Pindapata in Union Square. And then a lot of people would come and give us mixed food. So usually what we would do is save all the meat plates and actually give them to people who were there asking for charity. So we would eat the vegetarian food and give the thing. So yeah, of course, if there's option. So the Buddha didn't tell us that we have to eat everything given to us. That's because we would become obese sometimes, sometimes there's not enough, especially if one goes in places where people, like how we were going in Italy, it's people don't know who we are, and if it's very spontaneous, it's literally beggars can't be choosers. And there's a beauty in it, beauty of practice and beauty in the spontaneous generosity of someone just wanting to do an act of kindness. Yeah, and then sometimes where there's more options, and then of course one can go either based on nutrition or based on there are different factors. But yeah, definitely if there is someone else who can benefit who can share. I always say it's a double merit for the donors. So they donate to the Sangha, and also they donate to others. So that is absolutely wholesome. But yeah, once again, most of the time, it's important to understand a lot of different factors. Otherwise, we get into these sort of statements and ideas that purification is, by doing one particular practice. It's sila bhatta paramasa. Being vegetarian does not make someone superior or inferior to anyone, or doesn't make you free of greed, hatred, and delusion in and of itself. But it can be used as a good means for the end. It really depends, both on the person who is practicing vegetarianism and on the different sort of conditions and situations. But yeah, it's not fundamentally there. Obviously, in Mahayana, they have a different view, but in Theravada, in the suttas, that's what the Buddha says. And Dhammajiva says that, corrects me, so thank you for correcting me. Dhammajiva says, actually, Judaism has a belief in rebirth. The single life concept is Christian, and mostly during the process of the Bible being put together. How fascinating. I did not know that. Actually, Dhammajiva, if you can send us some more info at emptycloud.org, if you have any, I would be very interested in knowing more. And, I think this is Brother Diamond, who says, I concur regarding defining the terms Deva and Brahma using Western religious notions. Good to see you.
We'll be seeing him soon.
Yeah, he will be coming here soon. Great. And Taylor says, from teachings I've had, eventually humans will live on light. It's because this dimension is so dense is why we eat food, but humanity has to get it right before we get to that next evolution.
There are states of being in which one feeds on light or feeds on bliss. So usually it's in the Deva realms, but the Buddha also says that there are certain permutations of humanity which have these particularly refined bodies. But there's nothing special about that. Like, there's no spiritual significance to it. It's just like, well, cats eat meat, cows eat grass. Does that mean that a cow is inherently superior to a cat? Actually, no. And both of them are experiencing the results of their own bad karma, actually. It's just manifesting in different ways. So, yeah, there are some beings that eat coarse food, and there are some beings that subsist on extremely refined nutriment, such as light, as you mentioned. But that doesn't make them better. It just means that actually that's the product of a slightly better good karma, to have a more pleasant life, with more refined food, more pure food. That's the result of past good karma. But it doesn't mean that they're closer to awakening. The Aganya Sutta is actually quite interesting on this, because it talks about how in the past humans lived a much more subtle and refined life. And it was because of their greed that they started to experience a coarser, more animalistic kind of life, and therefore coarser, more animal-like bodies. And there's many different ways of interpreting the Aganya Sutta, but the most straightforward way is that, again, it's this migration through different states of being and samsara. And the more obsessed the mind is with coarse sensual experiences, then the more likely you are to be born with a coarse physical body. But just because somebody is a Deva or a Brahma doesn't mean they're closer to awakening. It just means they have a different kind of life than we do as the result of past good karma. Again, as I mentioned a day or two ago in a Dhamma talk, there's a big difference between mundane good karma, worldly good karma, and transcendent good karma. So the mundane good karma will get you rebirth as a Deva and a very subtle, pleasant body where you feed on light and all that. It's mundane good karma. But it won't get you one step closer to awakening. Whereas practicing sila, samadhi, and panya, that will get you closer to awakening. That's cultivating transcendent good karma. It may not lead to being reborn as a mind-made deva that feeds on light or whatever, but it will bring you closer to awakening. So it's important to distinguish between these two kinds of good karma. So worldly good karma and transcendent good karma.
So in that case, doesn't mean that being the monks or bhikkhu or bhikkhuni could get to enlightenment faster than lay people if they don't practice. Let's say that the lay people, they very strict with their precept and they do everything right. So that means they're getting closer to the enlightenment than the bhikkhu and bhikkhuni who did not practice seriously.
A layperson who practices with a lot of sincerity, who practices very seriously and with a lot of commitment and devotion, they are going to attain awakening faster than a monk who's very lazy with his practice. So that's true. Just being a monk, like just getting ordained, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to like instantly get enlightened really fast. So a monk who's very lazy and wastes a lot of time and develops a lot of defilements, it's going to take them a long time.
But what if they also very seriously strict as well? So being a monk would be a fast track?
Generally speaking, yeah. Yeah, generally speaking.
Why?
Are you thinking about it?
Well, who knows? If I get a good answer.
Uh-oh, pressure's on. I've got to answer this one correctly. I mean, briefly speaking, yes. Monastic life is a way of living which is designed to support the development of a wholesome mind. And it's designed to support practicing the Buddhist teachings as fully and completely as possible. It's more difficult as a layperson. And mostly that has to do because, one, you don't have the support of the precepts. So the monastic precepts are designed to help us practice renunciation, to help us live in a way which supports practicing sati, practicing samadhi, developing panya. So you can practice those as a layperson as well, but it's a bit more difficult because you don't have the structure of the vinaya to support you. And also as a layperson, you're usually going to be caught up in trying to support yourself. It's much harder to live as an alms mendicant when you're a layperson. As a bhikkhu or a bhikkhuni, it's easier because this is what the life is. So you can live as an alms mendicant. You can live a very simple life. Whereas as a layperson, you have to find some way to support yourself, and that can sometimes mean living in ways which are not so supportive to deep and committed practice. So you can make a lot of progress as a layperson, but it does tend to be a bit slower and more difficult because you do have all these influences pulling you in different ways, which are not necessarily pointing towards awakening. So it's difficult whether you're a layperson or a monastic, but it's definitely more difficult as a layperson. Yeah. Okay. We have some extra robes in the room here. So talk to your husband and we'll see what we can sort out. Yeah. No pressure. Take your time. Think about it.
But it also depends on karmic conditions, I would say. As the Buddha said, in fact, and so Bhante said that as well. But the Buddha actually, in a sutta, he goes like, if it only took for people to become monks to attain awakening, then, we would just wrap up all the little children as soon as they're born in ochre robes, and then the world would be full of enlightened beings. So it's not, in Italian, we say l'abito non fa il monaco, the robe doesn't make the monk. So there is a lot of truth into it. So in the sense that I think that this form is very useful if one has the right karmic conditions in order for the robe to make it useful. Otherwise, sometimes it can be counterproductive, actually. because it can be very challenging to, it does. I mean, it's easier because it's more challenging. So you take a lot of precepts that then create the conditions for you to see how you obsess a lot, how all the preferences that you have, all the different identities that were hidden that you didn't even know that you had. A lot of different attachments. Living in community, horrible, seriously, I love you all. I mean, I'm very but I used to live by myself. It was great. I would eat at whatever time I wanted to eat. I would eat the food that I wanted to eat. I would hang out with people when I wanted to hang out with people. Like everything was perfect, exactly like I designed it. I was miserable, but in a very pleasant way.
Oh, that's a great quote. I was miserable, but in a very pleasant way. That's great.
Yeah, but then here, on the other hand, it was, whew, I mean, so difficult, especially when I first started as a lay person. It was horrible on so many different degrees. And I was very much in control, of things, because I was still a lay person. I still had my money and I could still, control a lot of different things. But then once put the robes on, you don't control anything. And you are essentially married to a lot of different people that you did not pick. And that you don't have anything in common. And sometimes are of different cultures. So sometimes you even think that you speak the same language. Actually, it occurred to me, like last week, I learned why for the past years, I was not understanding a lot of the things that American people would tell me. And even though I was understanding the words and I thought we were speaking the same language, but I found this article that was revelatory of how psychology, like the prevalence of therapy in this country, has created a new subset of language that people use that have different connotations. Like if you go to a therapist, if you have a psychologist that you go to, you're familiar with that language. But since in where I come from, like 3 people used to go to the therapist. And I did not know them. Like I would know about them, but like it wasn't that popular. And I never went to a therapist myself. For example, terms like I feel safe here or I don't feel safe, to me have a different definition. Like I translate them in Italian, which have a different definition than safety, meaning I still don't exactly understand because I haven't studied psychology. But it dawned on me, I was like, oh, this is what that person was saying. So for example, if I interrupt someone whilst they're speaking, then that person will not feel safe. So they perhaps would say, I don't feel safe. And I'm like, what is wrong with you? Like, I don't have a knife here and like, I'm not doing anything. Right. So it's very interesting that then you have to deal with all these other layers that in your sort of sheltered life as a layperson, you don't have to. Do you see what I mean? So it opens this whole Pandora box of things that can be either really great because you're like, oh, I have all these things to work on. All this greed, hatred, and delusion. I thought I had this much greed, this much hatred, this much delusion. Instead, whoa, that was the tip of the iceberg. So it can be great, or it can be like, oh, wow, it was much. I can still cultivate wholesome qualities without it being this challenging and this stressful. So it really depends from person to person and where one is at. And essentially, my understanding is that the Buddha says, as long as we are cultivating wholesome qualities in the mind and that, our suffering is decreasing, then it doesn't matter the form that we're in, but we're on the right path and we should keep doing whatever we're doing and then perhaps switch forms if things.
Okay, when you talk about that, it made me think of another thing that to get into the enlightenment, you have to practice sila and then samadhi and then panyaya happen as well, all 3. then I noticed that in this monastery, you do a lot of meditation, and, and my question is, besides meditation, if it's not really let's say that it's not really my thing, okay? Did Buddha say that is it the only thing that you have to do to get to that point, or there is some other thing?
So Samma Samadhi is part of the Noble Eightfold Path. If you don't develop strong samadhi, then you cannot attain awakening. So no, you can't.
It doesn't have to be only meditation.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, sorry.
Because when you know you do what you're doing at the moment, that is also samadhi.
That's sati. That's mindfulness. So sati and samadhi are not the same thing. So you need sati in order to have samma samadhi. So it's a necessary ingredient, but it's not by itself sufficient. It's kind of like to make a cake, you need to have sugar. Mm-hmm. Sugar is a necessary ingredient in cake. Otherwise, it's not cake. It's something else. It's bread or whatever. So sugar is a necessary ingredient in cake. But if I just give you a bowl of sugar and tell you it's a cake, then you'll be like, that's not a cake. That's just a bowl of sugar. So in the same way, you can have mindfulness, but that doesn't mean you have samadhi. It just means you have mindfulness.
But in the Buddha days, if I'm not wrong, and reading in the history in the Buddha day, there is a lay person who went to Buddha and he just listened to one sentence or whatever that, and he enlightened right there.
So those are people who have already been practicing meditation. So usually if you read the backstories of those people, they were already practicing meditation before they went to see the Buddha. So an example of this is Bahiya. This is one of the really famous examples. So Bahiya went and spoke to the Buddha, and the Buddha gave him a very short teaching, about 1 minute long.
Right.
And Bahiya attained awakening. He actually became an arhat on the spot.
Right.
And people say, like, why did Bahiya get enlightened in 1 minute? I've been working on it for like 50 years and I'm not enlightened. Yeah, and it's because Bahiya had already been meditating for a long time. And he'd also been meditating for many lifetimes before.
I was just about to say that it doesn't have to be in this lifetime.
So the thing though is, if you have been meditating a lot in past lifetimes, then it will be very easy for you in this life. And in fact, you'll enjoy doing it in this life. So if you have a hard time meditating, then that means you have not been meditating a lot in past lives. And it means you definitely need to work on it in this one. I think you're just trying to find excuses.
No, I'm not trying to find excuses. I know that it's a good thing, but I just thinking that it may not be the only thing.
It's not the only thing. That's why it's the Noble Eightfold Path. There's 8 things you need to develop. And one of them is samadhi. You also need to develop the other 7. But samadhi is a necessary component.
So you cannot miss one of them.
Correct. You need all 8. Not 7. You need all 8. Now, you don't need to develop all 8 all at once. And you don't necessarily need to do all 8 in this life. But if you want to attain awakening, then eventually you're going to need to perfect all 8 of these. All 8 parts of the Eightfold Path. And that does mean doing a lot of meditation sooner or later.
Does it have to be sitting on the floor?
It helps, but again, there's 4 postures for meditation. You can't use the 4th one. You can only use the other 3. There's 4 postures. So sitting, standing, walking, and lying down. So we focus a lot on sitting practice because sitting practice is very good for samadhi.
Does it have to be on the floor? Can we sit on the chair?
You can, and some people get good results sitting in a chair. Ultimately, what matters is keeping your body very still and very upright, and focusing your mind. So some people, they can do that sitting in a chair. But it is, if you can, it's best to sit cross-legged on the ground. This is actually what the Buddha said in many suttas. In many suttas, he says, sit down, sit upright, and put your legs cross-legged. He says this in many suttas. So there's a reason he said that. Of course, if it's physically not possible for you, then you can sit in other positions. But it's good to remember, if you're able to sit cross-legged on the floor, you should do it. This is what the Buddha did, and that's what the Buddha recommended. If you can't, then just do whatever you can do and focus on training your mind, because that's what's most important. Okay. Yeah. And we really should wrap up. We're running over time.
There's a request for blessings, so maybe we can end with some blessings for the new year.
Okay.
And good to see you all, friends. Thanks for showing up on the last day of the year and the first day of the year, wherever you are. Showing up for Dhamma. That is a great way to end the year and to start the new one. So all good wishes of good health, of good wisdom, good samadhi, and good sila. And may the merit of all your actions propel you towards awakening.
Okay, so we'll end with a short blessing chant. Sabitiyo vivajantu savarogo vinasatu mate bhavadvandarayo sukhiri gayuko bhava Abhivadana sili sanicham buddha pachayino Chandaro dhamma vandhanti ayuvanno sukhang balam.